just to take an example from the class on elections, I have 3 lectures on money in politics, and almost all the students have heard of Citizens United, and they almost had all formed opinions. And then we read the court case, including the dissents, and we have a discussion about it. And every student is like, oh, I guess it's a little complicated. I never thought about it. And that's a great part about being a teacher. You get to say oh, here you thought this thing was simple and it's actually quite complicated. But I realized on many areas of public policy, students were just majoring in political science and not really thinking about a full range of viewpoints.
Freedom of speech.
Fundamental rights.
Freedom of conscience.
Academic freedom.
Freedom of press.
And the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the Free Speech Podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Welcome back to So to Speak, the Free Speech Podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. I am, as always, your host, Nico Perino. Our guest is Eitan Hersh. He's a professor of political science at Tufts University and the author of the book Politics is for Power: How to Move Beyond Political Hobbyism, Take Action, and Make Real Change. I first heard about Professor Hersh in March when I read a long-form article in Boston Magazine about a class he was teaching on American conservatism. The article, entitled A Conservative Thought Experiment on a Liberal College Campus, raised interesting questions about viewpoint diversity in higher ed, our ability to talk across lines of difference, and how to address contentious current events in a scholarly environment. As students return to campus during an election year with conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East raging, I thought getting a professor on the show to discuss how he navigates these issues in real time in front of students and in a classroom environment might help us as citizens understand the current environment in higher ed and perhaps point a way forward. Professor Hersh, welcome onto the show.
Thank you for having me.
So according to this Boston Magazine article, you describe yourself as a right-leaning centrist. Would you say that's accurate?
I don't know how to describe myself. I mean, I guess that sounds about right.
This would make you a sort of outlier on college campuses, particularly in New England. The article cites the statistics from a 2016 study that found that liberal professors outnumber conservative professors 28-1. And I'm sure that delta between that 28-1 has only gone up in the intervening 8 years. What's it like being a right-leaning professor on a New England college campus? Is it as terrible as the headlines would suggest?
Look, I mean, I think like a lot of people, my politics are all over the place and have changed as I've aged.
Join the club.
My politics are pretty downstream from religious commitments, and I would say that issue by issue, it's hard to predict. It's easy for me to predict. I think it's hard for students to kind of gauge where I am politically. On some issues, I think I'm probably aligned with them on the liberal side, and on many issues, I'm not. But I think being just a religious person of any faith on campus is increasingly of a rarity, and being kind of out of step with the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party is also puts me in a minority position. So I think I think if you're in Massachusetts, I might describe as a Charlie Baker Republican, that is, something, or Mitt Romney Republican, that would put you in the middle of the country, but that would put you to the far right of a university community.
So among faculty, though, does that even put you at a greater outlier? Is the student body at Tufts and other New England colleges more diverse than what you might find in a faculty environment politically, in regards to political science in particular as well, which I imagine is different than what you might find in economics or sociology?
Yes, I mean, the way I look, I don't really know my colleagues' politics, but I suspect that if it tracks with other universities, which I suspect does, that the humanities, history and anthropology are almost overwhelmingly or entirely lefty. And then in the social sciences, political science, economics, the more math-oriented social scientists, you have a little bit more diversity, and then even more as you go to the sciences and engineering. Look, it's hard to know. We don't really talk about politics even in our political science department that much. I don't know everyone's views about everything. I think by the fact that I teach this course, that I do some public-facing research related to issues related to the Jewish community, that I'm now the advisor to the Student Federalist Society chapter. I think probably people will make some guesses about where I am politically, and they might be guessing right or wrong. I don't know, but I guess it's not a top of mind that people's evaluating each other's politics, as far as I can tell.
Why'd you decide to become an academic?
Mostly because my politics are idiosyncratic. Like my first job in politics was as a Senate page, a Republican Senate page for John Chafee in Rhode Island, who was like the left wing of the Republican Party. I worked after college for a year at the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, which was like the right wing of the Democratic Party. And I kind of thought that I love politics. I love the idea that like we have to settle our disputes through elections and policy making. But when you don't have such a strong partisan or ideological bone, it's sort of hard to fit in as a young, 20-something trying to get involved in politics. Like, where would you go? And so academia seemed to me to be a place where I could go and I could have whatever views I wanted to have and not have a boss, most importantly.
So let's talk about this course that you have at Tufts then that was the basis for this Boston Magazine article. It's a class on American conservatism. And the article makes it sound like this isn't a sort of course that you find across the country. You almost needed to build a course anew. It's not like there were syllabi that you could look at from colleagues from across the country in thinking it through. What was your impetus for building this course?
I mean, I basically just saw I have a personal angle here, which is I went to Tufts. That is where I now work as an undergraduate. And in the early 2000s, when I went here, I found a very robust, intellectually, ideologically diverse community. I was, it was like right after 9/11, and I could process that as a student with people who are from the left and the right and everywhere else. Now, when I came back as a faculty, I don't know, 7 or something years ago, the student body had really changed such that I rarely encountered conservative students. I rarely encountered religious students of any flavor, and I noticed that when I was teaching my regular classes, like on elections, that students just had no exposure to conservative ideas. I mean, just to take an example from a class on elections, I have 3 lectures on money in politics, and almost all the students have heard of Citizens United, and they almost had all formed opinions. And then we read the court case, including the dissents, and we have a discussion about it. And every student is like, oh, I guess it's a little complicated. I never thought about it. And that's a great part about being a teacher. You get to say oh, here you thought this thing was simple and it's actually quite complicated. But I realized on many areas of public policy, students were just majoring in political science and not really thinking about a full range of viewpoints. So when I started seeing what is out there in other syllabi, there are number of classes at many universities on conservative themes or on conservatism. To me, they mostly bucketed into 2 categories. One was more like political theory, history of political thought.
So this is like Machiavelli, for example.
Yes,
yeah.
Right.
And John Locke, and yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of that. And then there were classes on sort of the history of the Republican Party or history of the conservative movement. But it was oftentimes taught from how the Republican Party got racist.
Yeah.
What I was interested in was actually neither of those things. I was interested in something contemporary and focused on public policy, right? So the class as is taught has basically 2 weeks on family policy, a week on religion, a week on welfare politics, a week on capitalism regulation, a week on guns and criminal justice, a week on fire, affirmative action, etc. So there are contemporary public policy topics taught through learning about conservative perspectives, and then just straight social science that is part of the discussion, mostly from the right.
And what was the response from your colleagues in wanting to do this class? It sounds like you got a thumbs up.
Yeah, I mean, people don't usually say don't teach a class. It's a huge amount of work to teach a new class, especially one that there's not a textbook. So, so I put a lot of time into it, and I think my colleagues are, I've heard nothing. I have some friends who are colleagues who joke with me about, what we're doing to the students here. But it's all very positive. And look, I'll have 100 students in it this fall, so it's good, popular, high enrollment classes that are going to help students learn new things. Like that tends to be a good thing.
At the start of the course, you issue what Boston Magazine describes as a sort of trigger warning. You note that students, when you first try to articulate a position, you often get it wrong or it might come out wrong. In other words, you're asking for grace and goodwill. How did that go?
For the most part, it went great. One thing that is a very early lesson in the class is not only is there obvious political diversity in the room, like in this room, we for sure will have some conservative students and a lot of liberal ones. But even the ones who say they're, two people who say they're liberal say, when they engage in the material, they realize they strongly disagree about these things. And they're trying to process that. A lot of students have this experience oh, I thought I was sort of like a down the line liberal, but turns out I'm complicated. And that includes on issues where people have just really strong commitments. I talk about at the very beginning of the class, I introduced a policy issue that we don't talk about at all in the class, which is circumcision. And I bring it up because it's a kind of a squirmy topic. It's not something that's really politicized, but it's something that I know people in the classroom will have actually strong disagreements on, and to the point that will feel very personal, right? So I talk about that, in my tradition, boys are circumcised when they're 8 days old, and that's been my tradition for generations, and for generations and generations and generations, and other students in the class might find that to be child abuse. It should be against the law, and if they wanted to make something like that against the law, I would find that very threatening personally. And how do we work this out? And I introduce that topic just to say that's what every issue is basically like. Welcome to the club. You're walking around people who have views you think are vile all the time, and that's how we operate here. In terms of grace, for the most part, it's so self-selecting that kids do a great job. I'm teaching this class this fall at 9 a.m. on Monday mornings. And if you know any college students, if any of your listeners know college students, that is not a popular time.
No, it's not.
And so,
a little bit more popular than the 8 a.m. class, but yes, generally not popular.
The 100 students who are taking a class on conservatism at 9 a.m. on Mondays, are ready for this discussion and are more mature and frankly smarter than the average student. I will say the Israel-Palestine stuff tested our classroom a bit, I would say. And so that was an issue that was so immediate. That is some big thing happened. And students were so obviously on very opposite sides. And frankly, I don't know if they know exactly what I thought, but I was very affected by the initial part of the war personally.
Yeah, I've got some data here on topics that students believe are difficult to discuss on college campuses. So FIRE has this college free speech ranking, and the core of the ranking is a student survey. Last year we did 55,000 college students. This next one is 59,000 college students. So in the 2024 ranking, which precedes October 7th, the most hot button, difficult to discuss issue was abortion. 49% of students chose, being one of many options that are difficult to discuss. Beneath that, gun control, 43%, racial inequality, 42%, transgender rights, 42%. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was 26%. But this next year, it's 54%. By far the most difficult topic to discuss on campus. But on some campuses, 80% of students or more say that it's a difficult topic to discuss. That's at Barnard, Pomona, Brandeis, American Vassar. And then you have a number of other campuses, like a dozen, where between 75 and 79% of students say it's difficult to discuss. That includes, of course, Columbia. So that is obviously an issue that students feel is difficult to discuss. And they talk in various surveys we've looked at about feeling a good deal or great deal of pressure to avoid discussing controversial topics in their class. In our survey, 25% of students said that they feel a good deal or a great deal of pressure to avoid discussing topics in their class. At Tufts, it's right around there at 24%. So how do you navigate that?
I think that some issues are hard to discuss because you want to be sensitive to other people. So like in our class, we have a week where we talk about gay marriage and trans rights, and we're reading conservative perspectives on these things. And students want to sort of like learn how the other side thinks, and from their perspective, which is almost all progressive. For example, we read about gay marriage. There's a question before gay marriage was legal in the United States of whether it's good for kids, for example. Yeah, are gay couples as good as straight couples? And it's complicated to even think about it empirically. Well, are they adopting kids, whatever. But and there's some empirical evidence that leans in both directions. For example, gay couples with kids are much more likely to get divorced than straight couples with kids. And divorce is pretty bad for kids on average. And so we can talk about that empirically. And we can also have a view that I don't care if it's terrible for kids, it's a right. And so I think just trying to work through on the basis of a shared text, how do we understand this? How do we break down the moral? How do we break down the empirical? That's fine. That's, I think, very productive. But on some issues, there are issues that there's an ethical or religious something perspective where people understand the terms of the debate and maybe even understand the empirical terms, but they're on other sides of the issue. And Israel-Palestine has a bit of both flavors. There's empirical questions. Is there a way for these two sides to get along? Did one side commit crimes this time or that time or whatever? But then there's also these moral commitments. And I think what's clear from the data is that many students don't want to be friends or in social company with people who disagree with them morally. If you are on a campus and you are pro-life, or if you support that a Jewish state should exist, then those are views that are considered by many students to be the signs of bad people. You're pro-life, that means you're a bad person. You support Trump, that means you're a bad person.
And is that new? You said the dynamics on campus changed since you were an undergraduate in the post 9/11 years. And is this something that's just innate to human nature, or is it something that's developed?
Well, the student populations at these campuses have changed. I mean, I don't know exactly what our ideological diversity is, but it seems quite low.
But what I'm getting at is this kind of moral revulsion to being around and having relationships with people. Is that new?
Yeah.
I mean, because presumably in a previous environment, you could disagree with someone while still dating them or while still enjoying dinner with them. But what you're saying now is that students don't want to have these relationships.
Right. So we have this long 50-year polarization happening where there are not as many conservative Democrats, hardly any, and liberal Republicans. And so social issues are highly correlated with politics, right? So it could be there, 50 years ago, you could have two Democrats dating, but one's pro-life and, religious and one is not. Okay. So there's that. I think since Trump's emergence in 2016, the university environment and many business environments also have changed so that what they think of culturally as sort of out of bounds has narrowed. That if you support Trump, for example, you're out of bounds, you're a fascist, you're whatever. And then I think that created a norm that infected classrooms, infected research seminars, infected just water cooler talk, where there is an assumption that we are all on the same page. And I think that's quite damaging because, of course, we're not all on the same page. And when the issue is, the difference between, there's obviously different proportions of people on different sides of these issues, right? So when the university makes a statement in support of Ukraine, that might be very unpopular to a few Russian nationals, but it's so few that they're not a major concern. But if a university has, 5 or 10% of students and faculty and staff who identify as Zionist, and you say, okay, well, we think you are a bunch of Nazi genocidal people or something, you're well, we don't think that.
So you're speaking about institutional neutrality there. That is the idea that a college or university would remain neutral on issues of social and political import or controversy in the nation, or not. As you suggest, they would issue a statement on Ukraine, or they would issue a statement on the war in the Middle East. Or do they find themselves in a quagmire when they start issuing statements, or do you think they have a moral duty to do so?
I think my view is that like universities should and can have a diversity of brands, and that some of them that want to be like First Amendment style free speech private schools can have that brand, and those who want to be institutionally neutral, fine. And but I also think there should be room for schools, for example, that have uh, uh, more guided by like religious ideas. Schools that have dress codes and honor codes, and say, we don't allow technology here, or we don't allow, that. I think there should be a lot of room for schools like that as well.
And how would you draw the distinction between private and public? Do you think that diversity should be able to exist in the public context as well as the private context, or are you just talking about private schools here?
So I think public is trickier because you have that constitution thing. But in the private market, I would say I would hope there would be a diversity. That is, I don't think every school needs to be a free speech absolutist school, because I actually think that the schools that say we have a brand that's focused on, modest dress and honor codes for not cheating, and who knows, like other expectations, like you have to work out every day, whatever it is, and that's fine. And that means that there might be schools that say we're the leftist school that's going to try to turn your children into social justice warriors or whatever, and that's okay too. I think where things go wrong is when the school promotes itself with one thing but offers something else, and I think that's where we've seen the most trouble. It's schools that say they, at one side of their mouth they want to encourage free speech and debate, but on the other side, they only will recruit students who are on one side of that debate, and only have guest speakers on one side of that debate, and come down very hard on students who do this but not that. I think like if your brand is free speech, then you got to stick to it. But I do want to leave room for schools to not have that be their brand.
Well, you actually don't diverge from FIRE really at all on that position. FIRE believes to the extent you have a private university and you want to organize around shared values, you should be free to do so. That's the reason that FIRE doesn't go after or do any casework at schools like Brigham Young or Yeshiva University, right? They organize around a different set of values, religious values in many cases. Brigham Young, you can't wear a beard, so I wouldn't be allowed to be a student there. And I think that's just part of a pluralistic society. And we are on the same page in the second part of your answer too, which is that to the extent you advertise yourself as one thing, you need to have truth in advertising. You need to actually live up to those values. So if you, at Yale, for example, have the Woodward Report, which says that students and faculty should be free to think the unthinkable, challenge the unchallengeable, and mention the unmentionable. If you mention something that someone doesn't like and the university comes after you for it, well, that would be an abdication of that principle or that policy. Although when one faculty member tried to cite that policy in a lawsuit against Yale, they disavowed it and said this is just something that's aspirational. It doesn't actually mean anything here, which you're seeing more of lately, unfortunately, particularly at private universities. But you see more colleges moving in the direction of that sort of institutional neutrality, although I'm not sure Tufts has. I could be mistaken.
No, I hope they will, but I don't think they have made such a statement yet.
What is your perspective on how everything unfolded post October 7th at Tufts? The article does make it very clear that it was a point of contention in the classroom.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think Tufts, like other schools, have created a brand that has been very unwelcome to conservatives, to religious people. So if you look at students across the country, age 18 to 25, who are associated with the university across the country, 30% are conservative. 30% of all university students across the country are conservative. About 30% also attend religious services at least once a week. And you look at a place like Tufts, and Tufts is working hard to and meeting benchmarks around issues like diversity around race, ethnicity, LGBT status, but if you look at their religious and ideological diversity, it's just clearly not been a big priority. And I think that has resulted in a situation with the war where like there were students who were a small minority of students, Jewish students, who felt one way about this conflict, and then a very loud voice among other students who not only support Palestinian rights, but supported Hamas from October 7th. The Students in Justice in Palestine group here on October like 8th or 9th issued this like sort of celebratory statement. We're excited about the creative strategies used by Hamas, and that group wasn't ostracized on campus. They were themselves celebrated and grew this big coalition of activists. Now,
do you think they should have been disbanded as an official student organization, or do you think, separate from that, they should have just been ostracized?
My personal view is like if you're celebrating Hamas on October 8th and saying they're like these are creative strategies, I think it's the equivalent to someone who's like a pro KKK person. Now, if the school wants to have sort of like First Amendment style rights, and we have some KKK people, I guess, and we have some Hamas people, and let's just all fight it out and have a welcoming environment, and anyone can say it. But that's not how the school sees itself. Again, all the same issues that Harvard and Penn got wrapped up in. It's like, do you have double standards where you are very sensitive around not calling someone by this name if they are gay, or but you're not sensitive about calling for terrorist attacks and rapes and whatever against Israeli civilians. And so I think sort of the same issues we had here I think we had at many universities. I think that there are some things our school and many schools should do differently related to who they have as part of their community, like how they build that diversity of perspectives.
I think Harvard just added a new question to its admissions program, asking students how they would interact with someone who they deeply disagree with. And it seems to be getting at the idea that when you come to Harvard, if you are a student here, that is going to happen, and we want to know how you're gonna respond to it. Which seems like to me a smart way to approach admissions for a scholarly environment.
Right. Yeah. And then there are things that have nothing to do with students or faculty. I think there are staff here who really like thought that it was part of their job to lead students in a revolution. So if you asked a staff member, who runs something that has nothing to do with politics, some center for student life or something like that, would Zionist students be welcome in your environment? So, well, we are an anti-oppression group here, so maybe not. So I think like that's the kind of thing that, like, in my view, like that person should not, a smart person who has that kind of view, like probably shouldn't be employed in a job where they're supposed to be treating students without respect to a political view. But look, a lot of people here, I think, believe that basically someone to the right of the Mitt Romney, say, is out of bounds. Like that, like they want to say that. I think they have a view. I think it's a very common view that essentially, like, something between the Hamas curious progressives and Mitt Romney, that's where they were happy to have a debate and disagreement. But then everything to the right of that is out of bounds. The person who is a member of Congress who voted against the certification elections, that's most Republicans in Congress, they're out of bounds. If you are opposed to gay rights or trans rights, you're out of bounds. If you're opposed to immigration, you're out of bounds. If you're, and so there, I think the one problem we have is that there's like a lot of people who think that just the bounds of appropriate discourse are very narrow.
Yeah. Well, let's question first principles here. I think we take it as dogma, and you and I would agree on this, that viewpoint diversity on college campuses is a good thing. But why is it a good thing? I mean, what's the sort of first principle that you bring to that belief?
So, I mean, let me say it from two perspectives. From an educational perspective, I can't emphasize enough how much of a delight it is to teach a class where you're exposing students to something they've never seen before. And of course, all of us like learning in that same way. A student has never thought about some issue like let's talk about religion. Like, is religion good for society? well, people who are religious tend to be happier, have much better physical and mental health. Does that mean the government should encourage it? How do we think about that? Let's read some different perspectives. What would it mean for the government to encourage it? Does the government currently discourage religion? If so, how? Maybe that's an old conversation too. I think for a lot of our students who grew up in secular environments, it's a totally new conversation, and it's just such a delight to teach students new things. And that's one thing. But why would they want to learn it? I think they want to learn it because they're going to have to operate in a world where people disagree with them. Where the people in their family might disagree with them. For sure, their future colleagues. And I think we want them to learn how to deal with that without their heads exploding. I think we do have actually some brand diversification where you start to see schools in the South, for example, public schools in the South say, we really care about this kind of diversity, and people want it. Parents want it. Kids want it. And, what I would like to not see happen is for the older, say, legacy private institutions in the North to lose an edge because they're thinking that people want something different than they want.
Yeah. I mean, to say nothing of the truth-seeking enterprise that many colleges approach. David Ogilvy, the great advertising executive, used to say that you only get a spark when the stone and the flint are moving in opposite directions. And so often I've learned from talking with people with whom I disagree, forcing me to kind of reconsider my initial premises and positions. And when I went to college, I was very much an anti-theist in the old Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris mold, Richard Dawkins. And I started to question that when I started in debating and engaging with religious students on campus. And I'm very appreciative for that experience. There was a conflict at Tufts last year, I believe, on September 29th, where a chapter of the Federalist Society, a national conservative kind of libertarian legal organization, held an in-person discussion, I'm quoting here from Boston Magazine, between two male professors over the morality of abortion. And magazine reports that on the evening of the event, pro-choice Tufts students frequently interrupted the speakers with noisemakers playing the sounds of booze and cars honking. The protesters kept at it even after campus police arrived. Only after a second officer showed up 45 minutes into the event did the disruption stop. How do you get students to remove themselves and engage with the idea rather than the identity of the speaker, or remove themselves and engage and put their identity aside when they're engaging in an issue? Or should they even do that in the first place?
That's an interesting question. So first of all, on that particular episode, I should say, in part because I'm an advisor to that Federalist Society chapter, they actually tried very hard to get lots of different people to be speakers for that event. And one problem that happens at universities across the board is that you have, why do you have so few debates, and why do you have so few conservative speakers? Sometimes the university will say, well, the students don't really want, they won't come to a conservative speaker or to a debate. Other times they say the speakers won't come because they don't want to be seen, conservative speakers don't want to come to liberal campuses, or liberal campus professors don't want to debate with conservative professors and give them a platform. And so there are a lot of problems with that I think that are a precursor to why you have fewer debates like this. But when it comes to gender and abortion, at least up until Dobbs, there's no relationship between gender and your views on abortion. There's as many pro-life women as men. I think a lot of our students don't like to. A lot of students on the left might not like to think that there's no relationship between being a woman and being pro-choice. But it might have changed a little bit since Dobbs. But before Dobbs, no relationship. Okay? I don't think that the students should be forced to attend a debate like that. But I think that if they want to attend a debate, they shouldn't be stopped by a bunch of protesters. I think the protesters need to let events like this happen, even if they disagree with them, if they want to be part of the community. If you're a campus organization or a professor and you reserve a room and people want to go, I would enforce pretty stiff penalties for students disrupting that.
Oh, yeah. And FIRE, while we don't advocate certain penalties for certain campus activities, we very much see the shout-downs, the blockades, even the use of violence to stop different speakers as being antithetical to a truth-seeking institution's mission. And behavior that gets rewarded gets repeated. So to the extent that students are allowed to blockade a campus event and prevent others from accessing it or prevent that event from moving forward, it needs to be investigated with all, of course, due process provided and punished appropriately so it doesn't happen again.
I was going to say, a lot of students want, not all students, right? But there are students who, maybe they have some policy issue that's really tied closely to their identity. And for that reason, they want to explore it more. And when they do it in a context of a class, it's such a beautiful thing because it sort of is a safe space. In other words, we're going to read some anti-trans thing. And some trans student might take that class, read that thing, and then the assignment for the class is you have to choose a reading to critique, and then they get to engage with this research. That's a very healthy way to learn about people who disagree with you and understand their arguments. It's a different context than the speaker circuit on campus, where you have more of an advocacy environment, right? There's no advocacy environment in the classroom. I think that makes it special. But I think the advocacy environment where you get to see people actually debate is also very worthwhile, and we should do more of it. I constantly been pushing the organizers of events here to have more ideological diversity, and because I think the students, it's good for them to hear from advocates too.
Yeah, I've actually heard some anecdotal evidence that the Federalist Society organizations across the country are having a hard time getting the American Constitution Society organizations on certain campuses to co-sponsor events.
Yeah.
Which
right.
used to be very, very common, right? The high-profile speakers coming to campus, speaking about legal issues.
Right.
ACS and Federalist Society would collaborate on those events. And now ACS, in a couple of instances that I've heard about, is refusing to do so on, sort of moral revulsion grounds that we were speaking about earlier, which is sad because I think everyone wants to see this sort of cross-partisan discussion, and the idea being that just because you're sponsoring a speaker or sponsoring a debate does not mean you agree necessarily with everything that's going to be said there, but rather that these sort of discussions are important to an academic environment. FIRE's college free speech rankings from last year, 2024, more than 2 in 5 students said that students blocking other students from attending a speech is acceptable to some degree. So it's 45% of students. That's up from 37% the year before.
Yeah.
And more than a quarter of students, that's 27%, said that using violence to stop a campus speech is acceptable to some degree, up from 20%. 63% support shoutdowns, up from 62% the year before. These seem to me to be anti-intellectual activities, anti-scholarly activities that the students just do not understand the basis for objecting to.
Right. So, yeah, that stuff is sad. You can see it. Even the students in my class on conservatism, who are a self-selecting group, many of them did support the shouting down of the pro-life speaker and trying to disrupt the event. I think that if a university said our norms, we expect the following, and we're going to enforce this norm, and that is you're not going to disrupt someone else's event, that is. I think they could do it, and they could do it very quickly. And I think that the selective schools actually have the greatest power to do this because, by virtue of their selectivity, they can say, "Look, you don't want to be here. There's thousands of kids standing in line waiting for your spot. If you are not mature enough to let someone else talk into a group of people they want to talk to, get out of here." Then it doesn't mean the student, deserves to go to jail, but maybe they deserve to go to another school. And I to me, if the schools wanted to, they could change this culture very quickly. And I hope they want to, but I'm not sure they do. Yeah.
Well, there's that old saying in business management, right? That culture, if it's not set from the top down, will be created from the bottom up. And that everything that happens in an institution is either created or allowed by leadership. And I think that too many of these leaders at many colleges and universities are acting more like politicians than like leaders of an academic institution, and are trying to please everyone, and as a result, pleasing no one. I want to turn now to talk about faculty. In 2021, more than half of faculty, this is 52%, reported being worried about losing their jobs or reputations because someone misunderstands something that they have said or done. Almost 3/4 of conservative faculty feel that way, 56% of moderates, and 40% of liberals. So you have the situation where over half of college faculty taken in the aggregate across the political spectrum, are worried about speaking up, worried about hits to their reputation, worried about someone taking something they said out of context.
Obviously, I teach sensitive topics, right? If a student doesn't like how I said something, they could file a complaint with the Office of Equal Opportunity and cost me like hours and hours and hours and hours of my life, and maybe even having to pay a lawyer to because the university's created this process of, I think ass covering is the only way to describe it, where any complaint goes through essentially an office where I think they're mostly like social workers, but they're acting as investigators, but they have unclear authority, and like you can be wrapped up in some horrible thing because a student didn't like what you said. And so tenure protects you maybe from getting fired from something like this, but it doesn't protect you from just wasting a huge amount of time and effort dealing with complaints like this. There's obviously also like other forms of public shaming. I remember I used to, when I was at Yale, I had posted my syllabi publicly. It was nice to be able to share syllabi. A lot of faculty do it. But then I saw at some point, maybe 2016, 2017, faculty were calling each other out on like Twitter if they didn't have the right number of female authors or minority authors on their syllabi. And I thought, why would I ever post a syllabus if there's a risk that if I don't hit some metrics that some bean counter is counting, like I'm going to get shamed. So I've since then not published my syllabi.
Yeah. And you also don't have as many tenured faculty teaching on college campuses as you used to. Far more adjuncts than there once were. And I should note, to the extent we have any faculty listening and you are reported for something you say in the class or outside the class, particularly in the class when it's pedagogically relevant, and you feel like this is a violation of your academic freedom rights or your pedagogical prerogative, reach out to FIRE. We have a faculty legal defense fund, and we provide attorneys pro bono to help navigate the internal disciplinary and investigatory processes. And we've helped a lot of faculty through those processes over the years. Many of those cases don't get reported publicly because we just help in the background. To end here, what are you expecting as students return to campus this year? Do you expect it to be as contentious a year as it was this past school year? And do you think schools are better equipped to handle it?
Yeah, so let me say a few things. First of all, in case any of your listeners are interested in this, I am like at the beginning stages of trying to build something a little bit bigger in terms of creating space on our campus, but also as a model for other campuses to diversify curricula, to diversify speaker series, to help students develop into civic leaders who are accustomed to debate and disagreement. And so if you have listeners who want to help me do that, they can email.
Does it have a name yet?
No, it doesn't have a name yet. We're very early. Well, it has a tentative name, but I don't want to say it yet.
All right.
That's number one. What I expect in the fall is that I'm continuing to create and build, hopefully, a bigger and bigger bubble inside a bubble, right? So I always love this time of year. I love the fall. I love meeting the new students. And to have 100 kids in conservatism and 100 kids in elections. And all I know is that for those 200 students, we're going to be learning in a way that is going to pick apart every argument on left and right, both, and it's going to be a delight. And I don't control what happens outside of my sphere, so I don't know what the rest of the bubble is going to look like, but I know my bubble is going to be great. In terms of what I expect to see the same kind of tensions around Israel-Palestine to suddenly reemerge as soon as the students are back on campus, and to continue maybe until I think if Trump is reelected, then probably the attention will shift to that. But for better or worse, a lot of the activism is quite faddish. So that a few years ago, if you ask students, like their number one issue was police reform and criminal. The police reform is like the most important issue in the world. And then suddenly, if you ask students now, like that's not a big issue for them.
And then it was abortion, and now it's Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah,
it's such a contentious issue on campus. FIRE said for a long time that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is like where tensions get to be the highest. We're even careful in how we talk about it. We don't use the word Palestine because it's not a recognized state. And if we use that word, are people going to assume that we're taking a political position on the controversy? There's a lot of landmines that you need to avoid stepping on and even just weighing in.
I assume the tensions are going to be similar. I think the schools are getting smarter. I mean, I do think at the administrative level anyway, schools are, I think, moving more in the direction of institutional neutrality, moving away from a DEI framework in which Jews have a very precarious position. I mean, I think like one of the reasons why this year was very hard was that the schools had developed and hired a lot in their development of a DEI framework, which they thought meant one thing. And then when it came to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and Jewish Americans and Israeli Americans and Israeli nationals, it didn't fit into how the DEI leadership thought about diversity, equity, inclusion because of a sense of who's an oppressor and who's an oppressed. And the Israel-Palestine conflict showcased some of the real serious limitations and risks of schools going all in on that as an organizing framework for their institutions, and so I think they're dialing some of that back.
Well, we'll see how it goes, and I wish you all of luck in building your ever-expanding bubble and teaching this course on American conservatism. Hopefully, it points a way for debate and discussion across lines of difference and getting universities back to that core ethos of truth-seeking. Professor Hersh, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Nice talking to you.
That was Tufts University political science professor Eitan Hersh. The Boston Magazine article that served as the impetus for this conversation will be linked in the show notes and is titled A Conservative Thought Experiment on a Liberal College Campus. I am Nico Perino, and this podcast is recorded and edited by a rotating roster of my Fire colleagues, including Aaron Reese and Chris Maltby, and it is co-produced by my colleague Sam Lee. To learn more about So to Speak, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or Substack page, both of which feature video versions of this conversation. You can follow us on X by searching for the handle Free Speech Talk, and you can find us on Facebook. If you have feedback on this conversation or feedback on the show in general, you can send us an email to sotospeak@thefire.org. Again, that is sotospeak@thefire.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Reviews help us attract new listeners to the show. And until next time, I thank you all again for listening.